As you probably know, the concept of G is really very important in our field, and it really reflects the view of the people who started all this, like Wechsler. His definition was clearly one that talked about general ability, not multiple abilities, even though his instrument had multiple parts from the very beginning, the verbal and nonverbal, so to speak. And what's really interesting to me is the recent research that people like Gary Canavay and Ryan McGill and others have been doing, looking at this question of, well, what do we know about the amount of variance that is accounted for after G is partialed out? And said in a different way, do the multiple scores we get from tests have enough specificity that beyond what you get from the full scale that they should be interpreted? That's the question. And this particular study is an interesting one because what they did is they went back to John Carroll's original factor analytic study, and they used a different factor analytic methodology, a more modern one that John Carroll didn't have at that point. And what they found was that the results indicated that anything beyond the overall score really had very little variance accounted for. And all these different studies here, they all found the same thing. Whether you look at John Carroll's stuff, or the WISC, or the differential ability scales, or the Stanford-Binet, or the WISC in Spanish, or the WISC in Canada, or whatever, they all found the same thing, time after time after time after time. This is kind of scary, actually, because we've been taught the opposite. And these colleagues of mine, I've known some of these guys like Gary Canavay and Marley Watkins for 30 or 40 years. And I have a lot of respect for them. They're doing something that's really hard. They're trying to take a very strong scientific look at our tools and tell us something we don't want to hear. This is the evidence. Study after study after study have shown that our intelligence tests, with one exception, the scales, are not relevant. The G is the only empirically supported score. We should not interpret the different scales, or certainly not the subtest level. Only one exception. Yes. So some years ago, I gave Gary Canavay my standardization data. Think about that. I knew what he was finding. I knew what he was doing. And I said to him, look, whatever you find, you find. I just want to know what you find. And if he would have found it was one factor, I don't know what I would have done. But he didn't. As he said, compared to all these others, the CAS has more variance accounted for on the scales than all these other tests, and that they can be interpreted. So again, this is not research that I did. It's research done by some people who I have a lot of respect for, and you have to decide what that means to you in terms of your practice. But it's just to let you know, when I was teaching, I told students never to do subtest analysis, not only on my climate assessment system, but on anything else. Goes to all that. Now, so if I'm going to say to you, past scales have value, it's fair for you to ask me, well, show me some evidence that they do, right? I mean, why not? ask that question. You should never take anybody at, just at face value. You should always ask anybody who presents you any argument, show me the evidence, please. It's not a hostile question. It's an important question that you have to have answered before you start using what that person tells you to do. We need to be scientifically based. So anyway, I've asked this question. Do profiles matter? Now, I didn't ask it at the subtest level because I know that doesn't work. And so I asked it at the scale level a couple of different times. And now the next thing I'm going to show you is a little complicated, so we'll walk through it together. Where did I get these data? From the manuals of all these different tests. So if you go to the WISC-5 manual and the WISC-4 manual, and you say, what do children who have specific learning disability in reading decoding, what does their profile on the scales look like? This is what you get. A little low on working memory, but everything, in the mid-80s and higher. On the WJ, you get this, really everything 90 and above. The KBC, you get basically a flat profile, which honestly, I was not happy about. Because I actually wrote a lot of the original KBC with the Kaufmans, and I really liked the test and still do, but it just seems to not be working as well as the CAS. I really hoped that the KBC would show a similar profile like the CAS, but it doesn't. I called Alan and asked him about it, and I actually worked with the research people at the publisher with these data to figure out if there's any way that it would come out differently, and we couldn't come out with anything. Anyway, we get this profile in the CAS. Does that make sense? Sure does. What's the problem in reading decoding? Sequencing of sounds, phonological tasks. So this makes perfect sense. Is this enough? No. What do we want to compare it to? How about comparing it to ADHD kids, the ones we often have trouble differentiating? Well, here's what you get. WISC-5 and WISC-4, everything's in the 90s. A familiar profile in the WJ, just higher on the KBC, but not on the CAS. On the CAS, you get low in planning. How does that make sense? I thought ADHD kids have a failure in attention. No, only inattentive type of kids have that profile on the CAS. These are the hyperactive impulsive kids. Impulsive, that's frontal lobe, that's planning. This makes perfect sense. Perfect. But here's the really interesting piece. When you put them together, look what you get. Here's basically your best approach to CHC. Woodcock, basically the same profile. That's unfortunate for Woodcock. KBC, just flat and flat. Very different profiles. And with the WISC, what's kind of interesting is first of all, you get low verbal scores. Well, that doesn't surprise anybody really, because kids who are low in school, they don't learn much. And the verbal scales are, I think, they're just achievement tests in an IQ test kit. I'm going to say that again. I don't think you should ever use vocabulary to decide how smart somebody is. I don't think you should ever use knowledge, accumulation of knowledge, to decide how smart somebody is, because you know who that disadvantages. It makes kids look dumb when they're not. Really irritates me. The only reason this so-called working memory scale and WISC is a little low, because it has digit span forward in it, which is most like successive processing, but it's so confounded with other things that it's not so extremely low like this. So this tells me, yeah, the G research says you can go beyond G with the CAS. You know what? It works. It works. By the way, there's a lot of research on other profiles, 10 core profiles on the basic standardization sample, profiles like kids who have simultaneous processing problems often have different kinds of reading comprehension problems and things like that. There's a lot of good research profiles on the CAS. I encourage you to read those. But let's come back to this issue. I like the Saturday Night Live research, weekend update. We're doing a research update here, We want to know what's going on, right? Well, let me remind you of something. The standards for educational psychological tests clearly says that if a person has had limited opportunity to learn the content in a test of intelligence, information, similarities, arithmetic, comprehension, or in the WJ phonological task that Kevin Magoo likes so much because it's high G loading, that test may be considered unfair if it penalizes students for not knowing the answers, even if the norming data do not demonstrate psychometric test bias. What does that mean? That means that when you look at a test manual and they say, we didn't get any test bias, and they look at all the psychometric ways that bias can be expressed, good methodologies that really came out of a lot of the work of Art Jensen, who I think was in a lot of ways maligned for being a serious scientist. But what it says is that's not enough for you to be comfortable using a test. You have to determine if the test content unfairly penalizes students. And this is where past theory really comes in, because with the neurocognitive processing test that I developed, they don't rely on knowledge, because what we want to measure is thinking rather than knowing. We want to measure thinking, not knowing. And what's the result? Well, here's the result. Look at these papers published in the journal Intelligence, Applied Neuropsychology. These are major journals that we've published in all this research on race and ethnic differences. Small Hispanic white difference, small studies when you give the CAS in English or Spanish. So Tulio administered the CAS, the English version and the Spanish version, in counterbalanced order. We published 2 studies on this, and we showed not only are the results so remarkably different regardless of what language you gave the test in, the decisions that you make about the students over 90% of the time were the same decision. Like, did they have a weakness or not, or a strength or not? It was the same, regardless of what language you gave the test in. That's a powerful statement that reflects what we're measuring. Thinking, not knowing. Now, how does this compare to other instruments? It's a fair question to ask. The top half, this is from my Essentials book. The yellow shaded at the top, I call these traditional IQ tests. They all basically are, in the same kind of perspective. Basically rely, the origin being the Army Alpha and the Army Beta. And they evolve and they've been expanded and modified and all that kind of stuff, but basically raw materials are very similar. And you get the largest black-white difference on those tests and the smallest on the second generation tests being the KBC and the CAS. The CAS, the smallest difference of all. And all these data come from published papers. It's all documented in my book. You can go and check all the numbers. You'll see they're exactly what they are here. Just look at the data. I'm just showing you data that's out there, information that you need to use to make good decisions. But just think about it for a second. All the tests that you use, all the tests that you've been taught to use, they have so much achievement in them. I just don't think it's right. Just don't think it's right to use vocabulary or numbers series or concept formation or phonological processing or vocabularies and things on and on. I just don't think it's right to decide how smart somebody is. Interestingly, there's a court case that agrees with me. This happens to do with gifted kids. The U46 actually was a school district that Tullio Otero worked in for a while. This district is 43% Hispanic, but only 2% of the kids in the gifted program are Hispanic. Sound like there's a problem there? Yeah, right? So Judge Gettleman looked at all the data, brought in all the experts, and concluded that the district actually not only discriminated against the Hispanic students, but violated their rights. Because what they did was they required all the kids who could get into gifted had to have high scores on verbal and math tests. And interestingly, the district used my Naglieri nonverbal ability test. But because their logic was an and statement, not an or statement, you had to have a high verbal and a high math and a high this and a high grades and, oh yeah, that Naglieri test too. That's why the kids didn't get in. To me, that's horrible. Because think of all the really smart Hispanic kids in that school district who never felt appreciated by the educational system. How alienated they must have been. I've actually done some research on how many kids are like that out in the US. I don't think I have that slide here, but I'll tell you what it is. If you go on my website and just look at my presentations on the topic of the elephant in the room, I actually did a webinar on this morning at a gifted conference. If you look at Black, Hispanic, Native American, and mixed race people, students in K to 12 right now in the US public schools, and you look at how many kids could have been identified and have been, and the difference is there are 850,000 people should have been identified as gifted and weren't, because they don't speak English very well, they come from impoverished backgrounds, and on and on and on. That's not right. If you read Yoakum and Yerke's original book on the mental tests, they actually say that measuring ability with a non-knowledge test avoids injustice by reason of unfamiliarity with English. So I'm not saying anything new. Okay, I'm just gonna tell you, you don't need verbal tests to have good validity. And you can look at this research paper as a meta-analysis that looked at PASS and found that PASS is more correlated with achievement than traditional measures of intelligence. And I will encourage you to take a look at my intervention research on my website, where we were able to show how students, in fact, you can help students improve in mathematics on standardized achievement tests, and the effect lasts at least a year just by getting them to better understand how they can use strategies. And I got a lot of research on intervention you should take a look at.
Thank you so much for being with us, Dr. Naglieri. This is wonderful. It's an honor and a pleasure to speak with you. And I told the students that you have generously offered your time even on a future date if there's further discussion that we wish to have. So thank you for being here today.
You're welcome. It's a real pleasure. It's nice to meet everybody and see everybody. And you can always be in touch with me on my website or with my Gmail, which you have. I often get people who say, I gave your test, I found this, what do you think? I do that all the time. And I'm happy to come back in at any time and help in any way. So look forward to seeing you all again, or maybe at a conference. Always come and say hi to me. Thanks, everybody. Take care now.